Hello again. I thought of a few more things I'd like to tell you. The item I couldn't remember on the what not to eat list was onions and things from the onion family. Those are also not recommended for quail. And I thought I would show you what my chart looks like. This is a list and some notes on 1 month of laying. So because they didn't start laying on the first of the month, I just kind of keep track of 30-day periods. And I like to try to keep track of who has laid, although in truth I'm not always 100% sure. 4 of them lay very identifiable eggs, and 2 of them I'm not always sure. But I like to make a note of if they are cracked or pecked by the birds. Hard to know which is which. Sometimes I make a little note on the side so that when I do my tally, I can subtract out eggs that I didn't really get to use. Some other miscellaneous things. These, if you're not familiar with them, are quail egg scissors. And what you do is you just go along the top of the egg and you just use the sharp little part to slice across, and then you can tip the eggs out pretty easily. They don't otherwise really have the kind of shell that's easy to just tap on the edge of a dish and crack in half. You can help them have harder shells by providing more calcium. Oyster shell, I think, is probably one of the most common amendments, and people, to make it quail sized, will sometimes, put it in a bag and hit it with a hammer to make the pieces smaller, or go at it real hard with a wooden rolling pin, for example. But in the size it's provided for chickens, it's pretty hard for them to use. And I've seen people ruin coffee bean grinders with with oyster shell. And I don't recommend that either. But I do feed shell back to them. You can either put it in the oven for a few minutes while you're baking, or I even sometimes will just put it in the microwave for a minute so that I'm not training them to like that taste of their wet egg on the inside. And then if you crush that up small, they'll pretty happily eat that. I give them chicken egg shells as well, which maybe because of commercial feeds seem like they're even higher calcium. I've read people are of two minds about feeding their own shells back to them, because I think there is probably a point at which they really have used what's available in the shell, and maybe they're digesting to not much benefit. But since they seem to like it, and there is already some calcium in the sand I'm providing, and some calcium and other minerals in the commercial feed that they take, it seems like a harmless thing to try. And let's see, what else was I going to tell you? Oh, I mentioned that I would make a small change, which is to make it harder for them to kick sand out from the lower part of the cage. I didn't mention roofs and wind screening, and it's pretty strongly recommended that they have opportunities for both sun and shade. They do like to sunbathe, but where I am in Barcelona, it can get quite hot, so nicer if they have a choice. You do want to have some way to block the wind. They're blocked entirely on two sides, 3 really if you count this balcony door side. So while they have plenty of ventilation, they're not exposed to the extreme winds. And if you're using a sand method, damp sand really is not great for them. So you want to have a kind of roof on your aviary that's going to keep it from being overly wet. Mine periodically kick over the water if it gets too low. That's when I ordered the the drinking cups, and with some help, just basically installed them in a regular plastic food grade container. And it works for the most part. I do occasionally have to clean more because they've wet everything if they tip it over. But there are different methods. People use something they call a nipple waterer, where they kind of peck at one little part that is sticking out from a bucket and get drops of water. And people seem happy with that too. But this is working so far. I, like many people, had a quail file on Pinterest and saved 1,000,001 coop themed posts that people had made, and was really delighted by a green roof natural quail keeping type post. But I didn't really want to water through it and be dripping water on them. So in the end, they just have this same coated mesh top. And I did put a planter box over one side. So they have kind of half the height on one end and full height on the other. I have not had the problem I read about and hear about sometimes of them getting startled and hitting their head a lot. I did have one lightning storm where there was some jumping, and when the thunder would arrive, they would whack their heads, but seem to have survived that. And I'm actually kind of glad that on the other side they can stretch tall if they want to. These are ground birds. They hop wildly given the opportunity, but aren't missing out on flying. And as long as they have, a sense of shelter and safety, they seem to be doing pretty well. If you live with dogs or have neighborhood dogs, for example, and you are not on a balcony like I am, probably what I've done here wouldn't be strong enough, because a big dog, I'm pretty sure, could push through this panel if they wanted to. We put some thin strips along so that no sharp points would be sticking out, so that for them to cut themselves on. It's I think a pretty nicely made aviary, and I appreciate my brother-in-law's help a lot. But you might need to adapt for you. There are some nice setups that I've seen where people have a rollout and they've got an angled base so that the eggs are outside the cage and the birds can't go at them. But that pretty much requires you to have a mesh bottom, I think. And I would consider doing that maybe for a grow out cage for males, not the slope part, obviously, but the mesh part. My 2.0 might be a mesh cage over a large Rubbermaid that I use, this container that has compost and quail waste. It might make sense just to have a wire cage and let it drop in and make it of a size that I could pull it out periodically. But the birds need to be not overly stressed to lay, and I think it probably does help them to have a floor where I don't worry about their feet, and they're usually distracted by whatever I've put in to eat when I reach in for the eggs. Domestic quail don't have a high tendency to go broody and try to hatch their own eggs. They can, of course, and if they're in a natural aviary, they're far more likely to. But mine are as likely to sit proudly next to their eggs as to sit on them. They maybe they know there's no roux, but I haven't seen a lot of maternal instinct from these 6, and it does seem like the males would do okay if they were on the mesh, and because they tend to have a shorter life ending with one bad day, people are perhaps less concerned on the long term about what it does to feet to walk on the mesh. Although I do really think having a place where They don't have to be on mesh, even if it's just a sandbox. This is about the size of a cat litter box, I think is a kindness. But people do what's practical for them, of course. Anyway, that's the my to be continued. If you're still watching, thank you, and appreciate questions and comments. Let me know if there's anything more you'd like to know. Goodbye from Barcelona.